1977 was an important year. It marked 100 years of Test cricket, and it also saw the birth of the World Series revolution. As Geoff Hutchison discovered, tension and upheaval often occupied the crease throughout that century of cricket.
In 1861, Melbourne hoteliers Spears and Pond sponsored the first professional cricket team from England. And on Christmas Eve, huge crowds turned out to watch the team parade down Burke Street. The Englishmen were paid £150 each to showcase their expertise in what was once a game of amateurs. And when they took on an 18-man team from Victoria, more than 45,000 people came to watch. The tour made a huge profit, paving the way for the first intercolonial test matches. A few years on, and Australia's first touring team went to England. It was an all-Aboriginal side, and despite the tour being a great success, the players weren't paid a wage or a promised £50 bonus. When Test cricket arrived in 1877, the Australian players turned out for nothing. But Charles Bannerman's achievement in scoring Test cricket's first century did not go unrewarded. A collection was taken up among the crowd, and Bannerman received the princely sum of £87, 7 shillings and sixpence. For many years there was controversy over who was in charge of the game, the players or the administrators. There were fights, player boycotts of matches, even fisticuffs, as they sought a greater share of the takings. But in 1906, the Orwellian-sounding Australian Board of Control took over, and by the time Don Bradman was delighting us out in the middle, it was clear cricketers were no longer masters of their financial destiny.
In those days, for Sheffield Shield, I think we received 10 shillings a day. That's $1 in today's money. Test matches, I think we got to £25. That's $50 for test match. That, of course, would cover the whole match, no matter how long it lasted. When I started, test matches were played to a finish. I played in one in Melbourne which lasted 8 days.
When Bradman led the Invincibles on his last tour of England in 1948, the players were paid £800 each. Almost half a century on, Arthur Morris, who led the Test averages, recalls what it was like to wear the baggy green before there was money, marketing and colour television.
There was no sponsorship money coming in, there was no advertising money coming in, and we all thought we should have and would have liked a bit more. But remember that the Board of Control only got the money from the gate. But when we saw the enormous crowds, we all would have liked the board to have probably made a payment to us.
One player unhappy with his lot was the brilliant but irascible Sid Barnes. He often described his player payments as tram fare, and on the 1948 tour even packed tins of ham to sell to the ration-fatigued English. But how could players improve their lot? Maybe becoming administrators themselves, although as Arthur Morris remembers, that was barely worth the trouble.
If you as a cricketer were to start wanting to be an administrator, unless, apart from Bradman I would say, you'd have to start off at the bottom in the grade committee or country committee, and then after 5 years of sterling service there you go onto the grade committee, and when you're about 82 you might be lucky enough to get onto the board.
As the demands of the game grew with each passing era, the warning signs probably emerged after Australia's 1970 tour of South Africa.
$250,000 profit for the Australian Cricket Board then, and they refused the Australian players any form of bonus. And I think at that point a lot of the players sat back and said, hang on, we've had enough.
Geoff Hutchison setting the scene with the state of the game leading up to the big split. After the break, launching the revolution.
Collis King couldn't quite believe he'd been part of it. In December, with teammates and combatants, he was celebrating the 20-year anniversary of World Series cricket. Here was camaraderie, enduring sporting friendships forged through revolution. Chief partners, cricket fanatic and businessman Kerry Packer, and film producer and opportunity creator John Cornell.
For Kerry, it would mean an expenditure of tens of millions of dollars, a grievous intrusion of his privacy, 1,000 or so hours of his time, the sporting press of half the world baying at his heels. It would put him offside with the establishment, half of his advertisers, the cricket boards of the world, and a fair percentage of the game's fans. He said yes. Don't you love blokes like that?
For Cornell, WSC is sandwiched between co-creation of the Paul Hogan show, where he played sidekick Strop, and the Crocodile Dundee movies. In early 1977, Cornell sought out Packer for support, with the idea of staging some exhibition matches to earn a little more for players like Dennis Lillee. The head of Channel 9 was more than receptive. He'd offered the Australian Cricket Board more money than they could imagine for exclusive TV rights in 1976. Failing that, he offered $1.5 million for the following 3 years from 1979. But the board wouldn't deal.
Well, it was hard to understand how they would deal with because they really didn't deal with us. I mean, they basically ignored our approaches.
We had a meeting with Mr. Packer in Melbourne, and it was at that meeting that he offered an amount of money for 3 years, and I explained to him, and he appreciated it, and said that we'd entered into a verbal agreement, and that, so far as we were concerned, was a contract with the ABC for 3 years.
The public wouldn't hear it, but this was Kerry Packer's message to potential sponsors from London's Dorchester Hotel.
And I believe that the finest cricketers in the world, and the finest cricket that the world is going to see, is going to be played in Australia for about 8 to 10 weeks every summer from here on in.
Players like Ian Chappell had struggled with the ACB over adequate compensation through the 70s. After a test at the MCG in 1974-75, when gate takings were $250,000, he asked some questions.
At the end of the day, I suddenly thought to myself, well, $200, I've got $200 for playing in this test match. Multiply 12 by 200, you get $2,400. That's not a really good percentage of the gate takings. And I started to think, gee, you know, Dennis is right, we aren't all that well paid.
While the ACB belatedly boosted match earnings with bonuses towards $2,000, the juggernaut had begun to roll. Chappell would come out of retirement to wear the pyjamas and captain Australia, and Dennis Lillee was the first player to sign on for a schedule of super tests and one-day matches for around $35,000. Recruitment was on in earnest, and the centenary test at the MCG was the pick-up joint. Any approach was to be an absolute secret.
And that's it. It's LBW. Alan Knott is out. Lillee has struck again.
It was a huge question mark on your face. You couldn't utter a word about it. But Dennis, you in this? Greg Chappell, you'd look around Dougie Walters, but you couldn't talk about it. We were sworn to secrecy, and so I went with my gut feeling.
And away it goes for his, could be his 50, out towards the boundary, a beautiful shot. 4 in a row.
A little later came the man who saw Tony Greig to the pickets 5 times in 1 over, David Hooks.
I rang Ian Chappell, who was in Sydney, and I said, look, what do I do? You got some advice for me here? He rang, he said, you better fly to Sydney and meet John Cornell, who I only knew as Strop, of course, on television. I didn't know the background, and I certainly didn't know the name Kerry Packer to any great extent. And I went to John's place, and he opened the door, and I was waiting for some bloke with a surf life-saving cap on his head, and some normal bloke answered the phone. I thought he must have been the butler or somebody. And John just took me for a stroll overlooking the bridge and the harbour and the soft cell and then the hard cell, and just put the idea to me then, and I signed on the spot.
My initial reaction was, well, that's interesting. Then I did it for myself. After that, it was easy. It was a good deal for me. I liked Sydney. I wasn't too sure about whether I could live through the winters in England. And, you know, so when I said yes, it was for Tony Greig first, and it was some sort of security in the years that lay ahead for my family.
Then came an overseas contingent, led by those who'd been paid a pittance, the West Indies. They would light up the series. The wicketkeeper was approached by his captain between overs in a test match.
We'd had a
very good relationship, Clive and myself. And he knew he could trust me. Yes, it was confidential. And so he was just, and I suppose in a way asking, you know, for confirmation that he was doing the right thing. You know, in fact, he was sort of, at the time, thinking that this was giving up your official cricket career.
It was great for us because, I mean, obviously we weren't playing at that level. You know, we weren't able to play with the West Indian players. We weren't able to play Test cricket against England or Australia or anybody else for that matter. So, you know, any opportunity to play with 60 of the best cricketers in the world for us was going to be a fantastic opportunity.
Off to England for the Ashes tour, the Australians took their secrets with them. The team settled for a draw against Kent, and a week later, on May the 9th, World Series cricket was exposed to all in the media.
It would have been the easiest thing in the world for me to say, I'm all right, Jack. I'm the captain of England. I'm on a pretty good number. I'll sit tight because I might have the job for a few years.
An advertisement in the Times summed up the mood. In affectionate remembrance of international cricket, which died at Hove, 9th of May 1977, deeply lamented by a large circle of friends and acquaintances. R.I.P. N.B. The body will be cremated and the ashes taken to Australia and scattered around the studio of TCN9 Sydney. Cricket's hierarchy was determined to stop the new chums. In late July, the ICC, the International Cricket Conference, threatened to ban WSC players from test and first-class matches. And people like Richie Beno, WSC consultant and commentator, were dubbed disapproved persons.
Well, we were two of them, actually, my wife and myself. My wife, who was the first woman, actually, to go into the press box in England to work for anyone, and myself, who'd played a considerable amount of time and brought a lot of people through the gates over the years, were listed as disapproved people. So I wasn't very happy about it, still not.
With the Ashes lost, World Series bosses decided to do what players became famous for in their games. They went on the attack, challenging the ICC's ban in the High Court.
I don't think it was critical, but it was a great fillip to our going forward. If the decision had gone against us, it probably would have made it more difficult to recruit additional players beyond the nucleus that we had.
More than anything, the cricketing rebels required faith. When Tony Gregg's daughter was excluded from a friend's birthday party, he knew what he had to do.
I was standing there waiting for Samantha, and of course her little friend Judy was having a party at the weekend, and she came out, and Mum didn't give Samantha an invitation. And I could see what was happening. It was a bit of a toffee-nosed school. And of course Judy went over to Samantha and said, you haven't got your invitation? She said, no, I haven't. And she ran over to her mum and said, you've forgotten Samantha. And Mum simply turned around and said, she's not invited. And I thought, well, you know, this is now starting to affect my family. Perhaps it's time to get out of here. And I did. I phoned Kerry that night and said, hey, look, get me on the plane, I'm ready.
New Liquid Nails Fast Grab has been specially formulated so it grabs with the speed of nails. And it dries with the strength of nails. New Liquid Nails Fast Grab. Grab it from your Sally's Handyman bar.
Because our soils are old and often depleted in nutrients,
we tried to turn cricket into a game of personalities and conflict. And I think that's what had been missing from the television coverage of the past.
Signs of the cricket revolution were under, beside and beyond the pitch, shooting the sweat and the strain straight from the crease to the lounge room for the first time.
The more we did the cricket, the more that we spoke with the commentators, the more we asked questions of why does this happen, why does that happen, why can't we hear that happening? We, again, just thought we should be there. It is a one-on-one confrontation from bowler to batsman. We should be in there looking at that.
By using close-up shots and by cutting between the bowler and the batsman to show the conflict that was going on in the middle of the pitch, the cricket viewer would have understood what was going there, but the non-cricket viewer, for the first time, saw what cricket was all about.
Until 77, cricket was shot from just one end, so every second over was seen from behind the batsman's behind. Producer David Hill and his staff changed that, using 8 cameras instead of 2. They took techniques from documentary making and baseball coverage, close-up slow-motion replays, film animation, and, notably, microphones buried under the pitches in protective condoms.
Normally what would happen would there be what's called a parabolic mic, which gives you a big wide perspective sounds, but you didn't hear the actual conflict, the thump of the ball, the thump of the bat, the rattle of the stumps, and I think that's really what changed the coverage.
The on-air changes had their dangers. Swift censorship would have to handle the candid comments through the pitch mics, but the odds were always against the roving reporter assigned to interview departing batsmen.
If we hit ball, yeah, almost good if they're out. That's right.
The broadcasts called for military-style manoeuvres from a massive mobile construction team, travelling nationwide and setting up at breakneck speed.
And I can remember day after day after day that we would be ready to go to air literally seconds before the opener rolled.
When it did roll, the newly assembled team of commentators was learning to talk to the audience in a new, more accessible way.
I was lucky in that I was a commentator along with a number of ex-Test players, a number of famous ex-Test players, Richie Benaud, Freddie Truman, Bill Lawry, Keith Stackpole and so on. And when we got to do the commentary, we were saying things like, you know, it's a good off break, it's a good bouncer, it's a good googly, backward short leg, mid-on. And David Hill would say to us, well, what is an off break? What is a bouncer? Where is silly mid-on?
Television has got a tremendous role to play there to not only to entertain people but to teach them what the game's about. What's a short leg or a fine leg or a third man? It's all foreign stuff to a lot of people.
Meanwhile, the players were pioneering new balls for night cricket. White beat out orange, lime, yellow and red in an exhaustive audition at VFL Park.
Kerry Packer was back in Sydney watching, and the telephone would ring, and everybody knew who was on the end of the telephone. So it ended up only David Hill or myself was virtually prepared to pick up the telephone. It became like pass the parcel in an Irish pub, you know.
I smile occasionally when I keep hearing that they can't get a white ball to play Test cricket at night now. I mean, Kerry Packer stood on the turnstile gate in the first night game and put people in the members' stand. Austin Robertson just stood at the back and painted the balls white and just threw them to the umpires, and we kept playing. And nobody knew any different. The public didn't know any different. So when the ball got brown, Austin just painted them white and gave them the umpire, and we just played on.
But before the first ball could even be bowled, there was a more basic problem to solve: how to create sporting arenas from the tortured soil of football fields, trotting tracks and showgrounds in less than 6 months. The Gabbers groundsman jumped at the chance.
How could you refuse to prepare pitches for the best players in the world for a competition like that?
Maley pioneered the transplanting of greenhouse pitches. It required all hands on deck, even the one that signed the cheques.
We're getting Gloucester Park in Perth ready for the first game, and we had a sit-on triplex mower, like a golf green mower, to cut the field in stripes. That was the only mower we had, but Kerry was pretty hands-on. He said, let me have a drive with it, son. So hop off and Kerry gets on it. And he's going along the field like this. You know, we're trying to cut it in razor straight lines for the first World Series game at Gloucester Park.
After months of work behind the scenes, VFL Park was finally primed for the first Super Test. But at least one man was nervous.
I don't think I've ever said this before. On my way up to the commentary box on that very first game that we did out of VFL Park, I was so nervous I threw up. And I apologise profusely to whoever the cleaners were down at VFL Park at that stage, but I threw up on I think it was the second stage going up there.
Nerves were put aside and all was in readiness. History was waiting for the first delivery in World Series cricket.
On today's edition, we've examined the origins of cricket's great split and met the principal players in the drama. Now, the show was ready to roll. But will the public embrace the product? You'll find out when the drama continues on tomorrow's edition of The Cricket Show.
Immersed in top-class cricket, the tight-knit group believed the public could be won over.
That was the feeling, yes, that if we continued to play good cricket, that at some stage or other they would come along.
Lily's pounding down like a machine. Pasco's making
We started off having a war with the cricket board. We ended up being friends with them, and between them and us, I think we've ended up doing a service for cricket, which has been good for the game, good for the individuals, and good for the general public.
What made the World Series drama different to every other sporting revolution was that it involved the game of cricket. After all, no sport has a greater regard for tradition or the value of accepting the umpire's decision. Make sure you join us again tomorrow when we take a further look at the most turbulent times in the history of our great game. See you then.